escape my slideshow and try to find my announcements because I totally forgot about this part. Tonight we have a guest presenter who is going to discuss the topic Science or Spycraft, How Astronomers Helped Conquer the Age of Discovery. And I'd like to introduce to everyone James Barnes. James Barnes is currently a dissertator and Lindberg Distinguished Graduate Fellow in the History of Science, Medicine, and Technology program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests include the history of astronomy and cosmology, navigation, scientific practice, science and religion, and knowledge production across cultures. His current research focuses on the Jesuit astronomer Christopher Borri, the institutionalization of science in Europe beginning in the 17th century, and the relationship between science and the state. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to the club, James Robert Barnes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction.
And give me a moment. I'm going to try muting everyone, and then hopefully I don't mute you. All right, and do you have any, James, do you have any preferences for asking? First question, I'm recording the meeting right now. Do you mind if we record your presentation as well? Oh, you'll have to unmute.
No, I don't have any objections. That's fine.
All right, and is there any preferences for if people have questions? Do you want us to take question asking breaks, or can people just jump in?
Normally I would say just let people jump in, but I'm not sure how I'm going to be on time. So I actually think I may ask to hold questions until the end.
All right, that sounds good. All right, thank you so much. And we look forward to your presentation.
All right, thank you. Is my screen share coming through okay?
Looks good to me.
All right. So thank you again for the introduction, and a lot of my interests got covered in that introduction, but some of the things that I'm also interested in that don't normally make it into the vita that I'm normally talking about includes the history of navigation, and in particular the role of astronomy that it played in navigation. I know that one of the members of the society, Dr. Jim Lattice, he helps me every year whenever I'm working with the History of Science 201 or ILS 201 classes, whenever I'm giving planetarium shows. And during some of our conversations, he's talked about the history of the astronomy program here at UW-Madison. And the fact that the reason we even have the planetarium to begin with was the training of naval navigators during World War II. It's where a lot of the origins of the astronomy apparatus here at the university come from. So there's a interesting story there to tell, although I think I'll leave that one to Dr. Lattice. But one of the questions that, or one of the reasons why I'm interested in the history of navigation and astronomy, as a historian, I'm looking back quite often, but I do so with an eye towards the future, especially now that we're seeing an expansion of the space programs all over the world. It's not difficult to, imagine 100 years from now that you have regular space travel. And so I think a lot of these questions about the training of navigators is going to become something that we're going to have to revisit. As space travel becomes more standardized, at a certain point, you're going to have to start getting people to fly all of these ships. But that's kind of getting off too far into the future and getting too sci-fi. So I'll try to keep things grounded for the moment. Another one of my interests that I don't often write about because with working on my dissertation, I don't have time in the present, includes the history of mathematics and cryptography. And looking at the history of mathematics and cryptography kind of necessarily leads one into the history of espionage and spycraft, which is kind of where today's talk comes from. So And one of the reasons that I'm interested in the history of espionage in particular is there are a lot of parallels between the history of espionage and the history of science. And I would say that as a historian of science, looking back at the history of science over time, one of the struggles that history of science had at the very beginning was the fact that a lot of the history that was being written wasn't being written by historians; it was being written by scientists, often who had retired and were kind of looking back and writing about their work. So there's a lot of interaction between those two disciplines, I think. Um, and just to give an example, two of the books I'm reading right now, one of them is called The Moscow Rules. Secret CIA Tactics Helped America Win the Cold War, written by Jonah and Tony Mendez. Jonah is currently sits on the board of directors for the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Any of you who may have seen the movie Argo about the exfiltration of American embassy staff back during the Iran conflict during the Carter administration, that movie was about Tony Mendez, Jonah's husband. So, and then the second, another book I'm looking at is Circle of Treason, which is the CIA account of the traitor Aldrich James, the men he betrayed, by Jean Vertefel and Sandra Grimes. That book is interesting because it's less about the spycraft and it's actually written more as a memorial of quite a number of Soviet agents who had turned spy for the U.S. and died as a result of Aldrich James's betrayal of the CIA. But that story is interesting too because it's full of science. That's most of what the secrets were that were being shared, were technological or scientific in nature. So, anyways, this talk came out of a conversation I had with John Rommel back in March of 2020. In fact, as I was sitting down and preparing my notes for today, I was looking back through our emails, and John and I were going back and forth about whether we should meet over lunch or whether we should avoid going out for lunch because of this new COVID thing. So, funny how that goes. Anyways, so that's where this is coming from. I'm going to go ahead and jump in now. So whenever I sat down to write this, I didn't want to write a conference paper or a research paper. So this isn't going to be kind of history for historians. I wanted to tell a story, and one of the two things that really stuck out to me whenever I went to do that is that there would be two main challenges to telling the story. First of all, the four principal figures in the story that I'm going to be talking about: Pietro della Valle, Mario Schifano, Zain al-Din Dallari, and Christopher Borri. I'm going to assume that none of you have heard of most of them, if any of them. Second of all, it's hard to understand the motivations behind these, what's going on with these four men, without some specific historical context from the period, which is 1550 to 1650. So I'm going to have to talk about that. To try to help everyone get into the story and understand what's going on, specifically what's at conflict and what's at stake, I'm going to try to enter into the story of these four people by looking at individuals and stories that you probably will be familiar with, specifically Galileo and Copernicus. So I'm going to go ahead and start with Galileo, and the reason I'm starting with him is because Galileo provides a really great window into how we tend to remember astronomers versus what astronomers were doing in practice. So this particular painting is by Henri Destouches, and as you can see down in the caption, it was painted around 1900, so it's a relatively modern representation of the story of Galileo. In the image, you can see Galileo displaying his telescope to Leonardo Donato. Leonardo Donato was the Doge of Venice, so you could think of him as the president of the Republic. Venice during this time period was a republic led by a patrician class, And at the time that this is taking place, Venice is in quite a bit of a deep conflict with the papacy, which I'm not going to go into those details. But you can see that the figure in gold and white, that's Donato. The man who's sitting at the table with him, who's in gold, blue, and red, is a fellow named Paolo Sarpi, who was a key ally of Galileo, both in Venice and throughout the Galileo affair and Galileo's conflict with the church. And then I just want to point out some of the objects in this picture. You can see there on the table an armillary sphere, which was a 3D mechanical representation of the solar system. Then you can see the telescope itself. If you were to zoom in on a high res version of this picture at what Galileo's holding in his hand, you'll actually see that he's holding an illustration of a cannon on top of a mountain firing a cannonball that's going in a giant arc around the Earth, which any of you who have studied or looked at the Principia Mathematica by Isaac Newton, it's a famous image where Newton explains how orbital mechanics are really an object in constant free fall. So here you can see Henri Destouches kind of drawing that connection between Galileo and Newton. And so here, if you look at the objects that are in the picture, what the part of this picture that's being memorialized, it's the science, it's the objects of science. But that memory, well, first of all, and one of the reasons I've chosen that picture is you can see here it was chosen as the keynote image for the recent anniversary of Galileo's, I won't say discovery, but maybe we'll call it the mastery of the telescope back in 2009. So the point I'm trying to make is we tend to remember astronomers and astronomy through the lens of the history of science, and that lens tends to focus on the positive history of astronomy while shying away from the association with war and statecraft, and especially nation building. So taking that picture, I would actually like to kind of juxtapose that for a moment here. This is a letter that Galileo wrote to Leonardo Donato, basically saying that he had discovered a useful object, namely the telescope, and that he wanted to present it to the Doge and to the Senate. And I'm not going to read the screen at you, but he basically explains that it makes large objects in the distance distinct and visible. Something 9 miles away appears to be 1 mile. It is a thing of inestimable value in all business and every undertaking on sea and on land. And I really want to focus on that, on sea and on land. There's not a mention of the use of the telescope for astronomy anywhere in Galileo's discussion with the Doge. And in fact, when he was showing it off, he didn't use it to talk about astronomy at all. He marketed the telescope as a tool of war. For this, he was rewarded. So at the time that Galileo gave this presentation to the Senate, he was earning an annual salary of 520 scudi a year, and every year he had to fight for a new contract, a struggle I can personally commiserate with. However, as a reward for the telescope, he was granted a salary of 1,000 scudi a year, and also granted tenure for life. At the time, and I'm not sure, some of you may be familiar with the history of Galileo, and if you are interested in Galileo, a really good biography to look at, if you haven't already, is titled Galileo, and it's by J.L. Heilbron. It's an excellent biography that goes into this in quite a bit of detail. But Galileo had been working at that point for years, trying to leave Padua and Venice and go back to Florence, where he was originally from. He was close to closing a negotiation to go home, but after winning this tenure for life, he was obliged to abandon that. And also his patron back in Florence, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, which was Ferdinand de' Medici, his patron asked for a copy of the instrument and instructions for constructing it. And Galileo denied that request, and it's a request that was made more than once, and it was a request that he denied more than once. but it was a source of tension, and obviously so if you look in the letters. And anyone who is familiar with Galileo and his relationship with the Medici will know that it is exceptionally unusual for Galileo to have said no to the Grand Duke in any way whatsoever. Basically, whenever the Medici said jump, Galileo said how high. So it's obvious here that this was unusual behavior for him. And the point I really want to emphasize here is that the telescope was a state secret. It was a tool of war, and it was not something that Galileo could share or was willing to share, not even with the Grand Duke of Tuscany, who he essentially owed everything to. Also, in addition to the telescope, you have Galileo's military compass, uh, a copy of which we have a number that have survived. They're beautiful instruments. He had these constructed in his home. He hired a craftsman to live on the property, in part because he was trying to protect the secret of the military compass. And he was actually engaged in a number of legal conflicts over the ownership of the intellectual property surrounding the military compass, which I'm not going to go into those details. As far as what the compass was, any of you who are familiar with the slide rule, it operated along quite a similar mathematical foundation. It was in part an analog calculator that would allow you to perform a lot of calculations quickly. It was also a tool that was useful for surveying, but it also, if you had the book that went along with it, and if you had instruction in its use, which you had to get privately from Galileo himself, it also had a number of useful conversions. For example, you could take the compass itself, use it to measure a cannonball, and then depending on what the cannonball was made of and based off of the measurement of the cannonball, his book would teach you exactly how much black powder you needed to fire that object for a specific distance at a specific arc. So it was a tool of war, and it was designed especially to aid in siegecraft. So, and to give an example of how much money he made from that, as I mentioned a minute ago, his salary was 520 scudi a year whenever he was teaching in Venice. His income from selling the compass and from the education that went along with it, he earned 1,000 scudi a year. So even before Galileo sold the telescope to the Doge of Venice, most of his income was coming from his involvement in war. And I'm going to try to move on and not get too deep into the details on Galileo, but just to kind of re-emphasize the kind of the sub-thesis going under all this story, this idea of espionage. If you look through Galileo's letters, and if you look at his accounts, which he was very good about keeping a ledger of his money. And if one goes through it, one finds an interesting note. And I say interesting because the part of the license that was granted to Galileo to basically monopolize the creation and the selling of the military compass that was granted to him by the Venetian Senate, it included a rule that basically said he couldn't export the item and he couldn't teach the item's use to anyone who was from not within the Venetian Republic itself. In the note I was mentioning, there is correspondence between Galileo and the ambassador of Milan discussing essentially arrangements for the private education of the nephew of the governor of Milan in the use of this instrument. Something Milan at the time was a direct enemy of the state in terms of conflict with Venice. But there are discrete letters back and forth, and then sometime after that, there is a note in Galileo's ledgers about receiving a locket from the governor, from the nephew's uncle, from the governor of Milan, that he valued at 800 scudi. So a gift from the Duke of Milan that was easily worth more than a year's salary teaching. So Galileo himself was, to my eyes here, directly involved in the selling of state secrets. So this is common part of that story. So I would normally pause there for questions, but I remember I said I was going to go straight through. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and transition, and I want to give a bit of the background that you need to understand, just to understand what was motivating the individuals that I'm going to be talking about, namely Pietro della Valle. So, and this should be very quick. First of all, you need to understand Renaissance humanism. So during the Renaissance, one way of thinking about, excuse me, sorry, I was reading the wrong slide. First, medieval universities and scholasticism. And here I'm not going to talk overly much. I mean, what you really need to take away is there on the slides. But the real key takeaway with medieval universities and scholasticism is that it was a Latin education. It was focused mainly on the teachings of Aristotle and commentators on Aristotle. And when I say an Aristotelian education, I'm talking about natural philosophy. So it was a scientific education. If one compares this to Renaissance humanism, you can think of it simply as a newfound interest in the study of antiquity. During the Renaissance, you had individuals who were becoming increasingly interested in being able to go back, read original works, including works of science, in their original languages. There was a strong belief by individuals during the Renaissance that the scientific teachings of antiquity had been corrupted and had been distorted over time as they were passed down. And during this time period, and also in history today, in the historiography, you often see this juxtaposition between the literary humanist education of the Renaissance and the scientific mathematical education of the university. Which brings us directly to Copernicus. So in Copernicus's De Rev, where he introduces his heliocentric system, there are a couple of interesting things to note. First of all, you have his the preface of the book, which is a letter directly to the Pope, to Pope Paul III, where he says that he first came across the idea of a heliocentric model while reading Cicero and while reading Plutarch. So here you have Copernicus behaving very much as a Renaissance humanist, saying these aren't my ideas, these are actually ancient ideas that were lost over time. So you have Copernicus not only making an appeal to the fashion of the day, to the Renaissance humanism, but you also have him essentially beginning a defense preemptively, saying these aren't my ideas, I got these ideas from somewhere else. And in particular, if you look in chapter 5, the title of which is Does Circular Motion Suit the Earth? What is its position? He names a number of ancient philosophers who believed in either the Earth moving or the Earth moving around the sun, or both. And specifically, he names quite a number of Pythagoreans. So that's all of the background I'm going to go through. Hopefully that's enough to kind of get everyone where they need to be to understand the rest of what I'm going to talk about. But the story I want to tell kind of begins between 1611 and 1613. And I just want to note that 1610 to 1616 is the beginning of what is commonly referred to as the Galileo affair. So a couple of important things that are happening during this period. First of all, you have a letter by Paolo Foscarini that's entitled "A Letter to the Reverend Father," letter of the Reverend Father Paolo Foscarini on the Pythagorean and Copernican opinion that the Earth's motion and the sun's rest and the new Pythagorean world system. So you have it's a letter, but it's published openly in the form of a book by a priest who is making an argument that the Earth is moving around the sun, and he is arguing that this interpretation does not conflict with the Bible. So he's arguing against religious authority. And then some other important events around this time at the beginning of the Galileo affair. This book that I just mentioned is published in Naples. There is a very strong pro-Copernican community in Naples at the time. Galileo was actually planning to travel there right before the church condemned the Copernican opinion and condemned Foscarini, which led to Galileo withdrawing those plans to travel. But that's kind of what's going on in the background of everything else that I'm going to talk about. So anyways, that concludes the introduction. For those of you who are familiar with the background I just covered, you'll especially appreciate how general it was. But hopefully it gives everyone just enough to be able to follow along with the rest of this. So the first of the four individuals that I want to talk about today is Pietro della Valle. Returning to the beginning of the talk, if you remember, you have Pietro della Valle, Christopher Borri, Mario Schifano, and Zainaldine Allari. So as far as della Valle goes, he had a reputation as a gifted orator and a poet. He was a student at the Accademia degli Umoristi, which was a humanist institution of learning. At the time, it was under the patronage of Cardinal Francesco Barberini, who was the nephew of Maffeo Barberini, who became Pope Urban VIII. Those of you familiar with the Galileo story, it is Pope Urban VIII who essentially sixed the Inquisition onto Galileo in the first place. So this relationship, though, for della Valle is going to be valuable because it's going to provide him later on with a gateway directly to the Pope. And this gateway directly to the Pope is both valuable for himself, but it's also valuable for Christopher Borri, and it ends up playing an important role in Borri's story as well. So here you can see 4 volumes from, and I have a truncated title, but it's The Voyages of Pietro della Valle. And over the course of his travels, real quick before I move on, do I need to hold on? Was everyone able to kind of read through that slide? Okay. So it's published in 4 volumes, and these books are the letters that Pietro della Valle was writing back to Mario Schifano, who was his patron and his teacher. And I won't go through everything that's talked about in these letters, but a good deal of the content that he is sending back at the time includes reports about the individuals that he's meeting, his contacts, and unfortunately, we don't have Mario Schifano's responses to della Valle. We do know that they were sending letters back and forth, but as far as della Valle goes, the main thing that he's looking for, which I'll talk about in a moment, is he's traveling into and throughout the Arabic world looking for texts that have been lost. And while he's there, he's doing this work on behalf of Mario Schifano, but he's also sending letters to the Pope. And in fact, whenever he returns, he ends up actually writing a private report for Pope Urban VIII that is not published, that's entitled Information on Georgia. And if one reads through it, it's an account of the military forces in Georgia. It's an account of their strengths, their weaknesses, who their enemies are, where one can find water sources near the city. It's an account of the actual fortifications of important cities in the location, what he perceived the weaknesses of these places to be. So I mean, this kind of surveillance is something that is a quite one-for-one comparison to what we would consider espionage in the day. If one were to get caught sending similar letters from the United States to, say, China, Russia, or some other power, you would probably be having a bad time. So you have Della Valle performing this kind of surveillance throughout the Arabic world. And, excuse me. So anyways, he sending these letters back. For people who might be interested in Pietro della Valle, we do have other letters and papers that are not part of this set that have survived, which were published by a fellow named Ettore Rossi in 1947. But finally, the most important thing that he wrote, at least for the purposes of our talk today, is he wrote a book on Tychonic astronomy by I'm referring to Tycho Brahe. He wrote a book on Tychonic astronomy in Italian and in Persian with the help of Christopher Borri, and we'll talk about why later in the talk. But that is kind of the foundation of where this story begins. It's Pietro della Valle's travels throughout the Arabic world, the surveillance he's doing, and his meeting eventually with Christopher Borri. So I mentioned earlier that Della Valle is working on behalf of an individual named Mario Schipano. So unfortunately, we know considerably less about Della Valle's mentor. We do know that he was proposed for membership in the Accademia delle Lincei, which is the Academy of the Lynxes. For people who have studied Galileo, you may be familiar with the Academy of the Lynxes, but for those who haven't, the Academy of the Lynxes was a secular academic society that was funded by an Italian prince named Federico Cesi. And notably, Galileo was a member. The Lincei did a lot of work to defend Galileo whenever Galileo had his first brush with the Inquisition, which I'll talk about briefly here in a minute. But within Italy, they were a very important society for the promotion of what we would today call the sciences. During one of his visits to one of the meetings, Schipano wrote in a book describing himself as a doctor of Naples, a medical philosopher, not ignorant of the Arabic languages. So that gives an idea of how Schipano was marketing himself to other individuals. But another interesting contact with Schipano is actually through the personage of Fabio Collana. Fabio Collana was a botanist and was also a prominent member in the Accademia Lincei. He was a friend of Galileo, and in fact, Collana was one of the individuals who was acting on Galileo's behalf and on behalf of the Academy during the beginning of the Galileo affair. And eventually, it was with the help of Schipano, Collana would establish a branch of the Accademia delle Lincei in Naples. And so this Neapolitan branch of the Lincei, the fact that you have this group of people in Naples who are friendly to Galileo, they are friendly to the Academy of the Lynxes, they're friendly to the Copernican opinion. There's a lot of activity centered in that location, and it's out of that context that you have Della Valle beginning his travels throughout the Arabic world. So one way of looking at Della Valle is as an individual acting abroad on behalf of this Neapolitan circle of academics and educated people. And notably, these individuals are not friendly to the papacy. They are not friendly to Aristotelianism in the universities. So, and just briefly to kind of get us back onto Della Valle, I do want to talk about the Galileo affair for a minute. for people who aren't familiar with the Galileo affair and Galileo's brush with the church, the Galileo affair has two distinct phases. You have the first phase where Galileo has his first brush with the Inquisition, and well, it's not even really a brush with an Inquisition. He dodges the Inquisition the first time around. So during this time, when I say this time, I mean between 1610 and 1616, you have a good deal of activity, intellectual activity going on in favor of the Copernican system of the world, of the heliocentric model. I already mentioned earlier the letter by Foscarini. So you have this text by a priest. You have another similar text by an individual named De Zuniga, and his work is called On Job, and it's specifically on the Book of Job. And the reason the Book of Job is important is because if one reads through the book, it contains a good deal of commentary on the cosmos. So it has a lot of what we would call cosmogony. It has a lot of history of how the world and the universe supposedly came into existence. And because it was part of the Bible, it was considered an authoritative text. And so you have Foscarini, who talked about Job in his own work. You have De Zuniga, who is writing explicitly on the Book of Job, focusing on it. And if one looks through Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess, and this is the text that gets Galileo his slap on the wrist, you have Galileo himself referencing the Book of Job. For example, here you can see him saying that he stretcheth out the north over the void and hangeth the earth above nothing. St. Thomas Aquinas notes that the Bible calls void and nothing that space that we know to be not empty but filled with air. So that quote right there, what's going on is Galileo is referring to this idea that was being argued by De Zuniga, by Foscarini, by quite a number of individuals, that the Bible quite often was not speaking literally. And it was this idea that the Bible was often written in a layman's tongue with the intent of converting pagans. And so simply because the Bible said something in one way, it didn't necessarily mean that that's the way it was in reality. And then he also talks about, in addition to the Book of Job itself, he also references commentaries on Job by Didacus of Stunica. And I'm not going to go through them, but this emphasis on the Book of Job is going to be important because it's really the reason that Della Valle is sent on his mission in the first place. And so, anyways, Galileo does get a slap on the wrist, as I said. However, as a result of everything that happens with all of these texts, you have De Zuniga's text banned by the Index, or censored by the Inquisition. You have Foscarini censured, and you have his book banned. And then Copernicus is not banned, but it is placed on the index of books with the note that it needs to be revised, or that certain statements in it need to be fixed before it's okay to publish. And as far as Galileo goes, he has a private meeting with a cardinal who's sent in to handle it, which I'm not going to go into that in more detail, and is basically told that he needs to back off, and which he does until he publishes his dialogue, which is in the 1630s. And so you have this 15-year interlude between Galileo first brushing with the brushing with the Inquisition, and then his final trial. So, as I said, this brings us back to Della Valle's mission. So Schipano was the goal of his mission. Schipano was sending him to the Arabic world, hoping that Della Valle could find an ancient version of the Book of Job, an urtext, and the idea was that if they could find this text, which they believed was written by the Chaldeans during the time of Moses, that it would contain a correct description of the cosmos and the birth of the cosmos that could be used to defend the Copernican opinion, and specifically that could be used to undermine the church and the authorities in the church that were using the authority of the Inquisition to kind of crush that that scientific theory. Della Valle, he begins in 1614. He spends 2 years basically learning the languages he's going to need in Turkey. And then after that, he departs, he goes to Egypt. Whenever he gets to Egypt, he goes down a bit of a rabbit hole, I think, at least that's my interpretation of it. But you see him buying mummies, he's buying all kinds of weird artistic works of art, and he's sending these things back to Schipano. And again, we don't have Schipano's letters to Della Valle, but it seems like he may have gotten a bit of a reprimand at that point, because he distinctly drops the search for mummies and things like that, and he really becomes focused on finding this book of Job. So he specifically he goes searching for the remnants of the Samaritans, who he and Schipano both believed would possess this ancient Chaldean version of the book of Job. While he was traveling, he was forced to seek allies basically wherever he could find them. He encountered a lot of resistance from local Muslim rulers, and because of this, he often had to seek allies among local Christians or among local communities of Jews. And where he could, he would try to make allies with Muslim scholars, and in particular, while he was traveling, and it was actually near the end of his travels, so he begins traveling in earnest in 1616, and it's in 1622 that he encounters a young man named Zain al-Din al-Lari, who he describes as a physician, and we can gather from the letters that he's trying to convince al-Lari to help him access the community of Jews in the city. And like I said, normally Della Valle didn't have any problems making inroads with the Jewish communities he encountered, but from his letters, it's not clear why, but he's having trouble getting the Jewish community in Lar to take him seriously, to host him, and to interact with him. And so he spends a lot of time trying to get al-Lari, who is apparently on good terms with the local Jewish population. He's trying to convince al-Lari to make those introductions, or if not make the introductions, at least go and talk to the Jews and buy a copy of this book for him if they have it. He fails. We know this, and he leaves in 1622, basically at the end of his travels, and ends up in the off the coast of India in the Portuguese settlement in Gao. And it's in Gao that we have this meeting between Della Valle and Christopher Borri, and which is going to be kind of the rest of the talk, is talking about this meeting and what they were trying to do. And while visiting Gao, at the time, Gao was had a strong Portuguese presence, and there was a large foundation there that was operated by the Jesuits, which were the Jesuits, also called the Society of Jesus. It was it was and it is an order of monks that exists under the Catholic Church, and they had a strong presence in Gao, not just in terms of missionary presence, but also through their work with the Portuguese Empire and their relationship with the king. There was also a strong military presence there as well. And so it's while staying in this foundation that he Della Valle encounters Borri. And while he's talking with Borri, he basically tells him what his mission was, the fact that he was traveling, he was looking for these books that he had failed to obtain. Really, he had obtained a lot during his travels, but he had not gotten the thing he was after, which is this text, this original book of Job. And while talking about this with Borri, Borri started talking with him about his own experiences as a missionary. And one of the things that Borri specifically boasted of was his ability to use astronomy as a tool of conversion during his time in the East. And I say boasted there because, and keeping in mind that Borri is the person who I do most of my research on, how to put this nicely and also appropriately. I won't speak in Texan. He had a tendency to boast, and we'll just leave it at that. And he had a tendency to exaggerate his experiences and his accomplishments. Just to give you a brief example, in one of the books that I'm about to talk about here in a second, he talks about being impressed by the efficacy of Chinese medicine. And specifically, he talks about falling off of an elephant, being injured, and being visited by every European doctor that he could find. None of them could help him. Then these Chinese doctors visit him. They put this ointment on him, and within a day, he's better. So he tracks down one of these Chinese doctors, gets them to give him the recipe, which to test this, he said he found a chicken and snapped its leg. And then after putting this ointment on it, the chicken was cured the next day. So to give you a flavor of the man. But nonetheless, this boasting appears to have impressed Della Valle. And so he and Borri set to work on a book that hopefully Della Valle was going to use for his mission. So at this point, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Borri and a little bit more talking, and here I'm really going to focus on the astronomer's role in the service of warfare. So Borri, as far as Borri's work, he actually produced quite a few texts. I'm not going to talk about all of them. These are some of the most notable. The first one is the, and sorry about that, I meant to go back and translate all of them. But the Relazione della Nuova Missione al Regno della Consegna, that one is a relation of a new mission into the Kingdom of Cochin China. And so that text is, it was actually an exceptionally successful book. It was translated into 6 languages and ended up being going through multiple publications. And it wasn't just translated into 6 languages, but it was often translated multiple times. So, for example, we have 2 translations in English, 2 in Dutch, 3 in French. It was an exceptionally popular work, and it was written as a genre. It was the beginning. It was one of the first books published in what would become a genre for Jesuit travel missionaries. And the way these books were often written, whenever a missionary would go to a country, they would spend time there working on their mission. They would come home, and then they would write a book where they would write one book, which is basically a secular text talking about this is the state of the kingdom, this is what its customs are, this is what its people are like, this is what you can find there that's valuable that you could sell back in the West. If you were going to go there, and if you were going to try to set up either a military presence or a merchant presence, these are the individuals you should talk to because they are friendly to Westerners. And then there would be a second book that they would write, which would be on the spiritual state of the kingdom. And there they would talk about the successes they had in terms of their mission work. It would talk about the struggles they had. Usually there would be as part of the book where they would talk about individuals there who were martyred as a result of the missionary activity. And that part of the text was meant to be used by Jesuits who might be going and going there to have their own mission in the future. And so you see this book, this format, it becomes pretty standard. But Borri is one of the first to write in this format. The second text, and here I did translate it. It's the astronaut. You have his Collecta Astronomica, which the English translation is astronomical collection on the three heavens: aerial, sidereal, and empyrean. This text is important because it's really Borri's life's work. If you go through the entire story of Christopher Borri, it's a lot of it comes down to him basically going through the motions that he needs to get this book published. And it's his own personal theory of how the heavens are constructed. And it's a scientific text at the same time, as well as a spiritual text. It contains a lot of science. It also contains a lot of theology. You have The Art of Navigation, which was published while he was in Portugal after his travels, and I'll talk about his journey here in just a second. But sorry, I just realized I'm getting short on time, so I'm going to rush to be done at 25. So we have time for questions. Anyways, The Art of Navigation is the notes that he used while teaching at the AULA de SFERA, which I'll talk about very briefly here in a second. But in that text, Borri is talking about specifically how to use astronomy for the purposes of navigation, for the purposes of surveying. And it's specifically designed to teach naval pilots, people who are going to be going into the military in the service of the Kingdom of Portugal, teaching them how to navigate ships. And then finally, you have the rule of Christopher Borri, which I'm actually going to skip talking about this book in detail just to try to save time. But it's an interesting text where Borri claims to have discovered a method for measuring longitude at sea using magnetism. If you're interested in how that might work, there's actually a very good article about the attempt to use magnetism for longitude. It's an article by Jim Bennett. It's called The Mechanics, Philosophy, and Mechanical Philosophy, and it talks about a specific instrument called a dip circle. So if you're interested, that's something you could look at, but I am going to skip ahead. So the Aula de SFERA it was a course taught at the Colégio de Santo in Lisbon, and as I said, it was a class that was taught by the Jesuits, and it was an obligation they had to the crown. And in addition to teaching astronomy and piloting and navigation, they also taught things like military fortification. And again, I'm going to be rushing ahead at this point. But this class, the primary purpose of it, really boiled into a nutshell, was to bring in teachers who were not from Portugal to teach science that was new, that had been discovered in other countries, and to spread that knowledge amongst the future leadership of Portugal's military. So not necessarily espionage, but it's still an attempt to kind of stay on top of this intelligence from other countries. Here you can kind of see the black arrows are giving a chronology of Borri's travel. And I just shared this slide in case people aren't familiar with the locations. But Borri begins in Milan, and the irony here to understand, and I'm actually going to run a little bit over 25, so we may not have as much time for minutes or for questions. But there is a lot of irony in Christopher Borri's life. So he begins teaching in 1611 in Milan, and one of the reasons that he's important is he is the first Jesuit to teach Tychonic astronomy in the universities in Europe. And there is some dispute about whether he was the first. It looks like he was probably the second, but he was one of the first to teach Tychonic astronomy in the universities, period. And I'll talk about what Tychonic astronomy is very briefly in a second. Part of his teachings, though, was the teaching that there was a fluid heaven. And because the Jesuits were they were not in a good place with the current Pope when this was taking place, and because the teaching of the fluid heavens was very closely connected to the Copernican arguments that were being condemned, Borri was told to knock it off, and he was fired for teaching this theory of a fluid heavens. And he ends up being rusticated, and they're like, okay, we're going to send you on a mission. And so they send him to what is today southern Vietnam, then called Cochin, China. And for anyone who's ever worked in corporate, this story will not shock you at all. Once he arrives in Cochin, China, Borri is told, hey, didn't you used to teach a fluid heavens? We're having trouble getting the Chinese astronomers to take us seriously because they don't believe in this crystalline sphere bit. So we want you to write us a book on fluid heavens explaining how European astronomy is completely copacetic with their view of a fluid heavens. So he's fired for teaching a fluid heavens in Italy and immediately set to work on writing a book explaining how it's possible once he arrives on the other side of the world. He ends up being fired from his mission. I'm not going to go into the details, but he spent a year being remediated actually in China, and they eventually decided after a year that he simply lacked the fervor and the temperament to be a good missionary, and so they decided, we're going to ship him back to Europe. The very short version of what happened there is Borri did not want to be a priest. He wanted to be an astronomer, and that kept getting in the way of his mission. And so he ends up being sent back. You can see right here that whenever I was mentioning Gao earlier, this is where Borri meets Della Valle on his way back to Europe. And it's there that the two come up with this idea that they're going to write this book on Tychonic astronomy. So again, I don't have time to talk about these, so I'm going to be rushing through them. This is a sampling of the Art of Navigation that Borri wrote. So it exists as a manuscript. It never actually was published until the 1900s when a historian came along and did it. But it does exist in manuscript. It's currently at the University of Lisbon. Here over on the left-hand side, I just want to point out that coat of arms. That is the coat of arms of Borri's student, Gregory de Castelo Branco, who was the Count of Villanueva, Sorteja, and Goy in Portugal and Spain. And really I do want to emphasize that connection between the Jesuits, the Portuguese crown, and Borri in general. Here you have his Collecta Astronomica, which is written in Latin. Something I didn't mention is that the class on the sphere, the AULA de SFERA, was taught in the vernacular to make what had previously been scientific knowledge that was locked behind the Latin language to make it available to individuals who spoke Portuguese. But again, you can see the coat of arms. But this is the book that I want to talk about, which I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about at this point. But zooming in, you can see one of the things that really makes this book unique is the fact that it's written in Italian and facing Persian. And while I can work in Arabic, I'm not an expert in Persian. I have it on good authority from people who are experts in Persian that his Persian was atrocious. But you do have this facing text, and you can see the title here. It's a compendium of a treatise by Father Christopher Borri, Jesuit, on the new constitution of the world according to Tycho Brahe. I'm going to skip these pictures. These pictures are from inside of the AULA ESFERA, and there's all kinds of astronomical activity there, but I just don't have time to talk about it. Here you have a picture of the crystalline spheres that I was talking about. This is the cosmos according to Ptolemy. This is the theory of astronomy that is being attacked by the Copernicans and also by Tycho Brahe. Here you have the cosmos according to Copernicus, taken from Copernicus's De Rev. And then here you have the cosmos according to Tycho Brahe. And again, this particular screenshot is taken from this text. And so I'm basically out of time if I'm reading that clock correct. Is that right, Lawrence?
Yeah, you're doing fine. Yeah, we'll try to wrap things up as good as we can, but I think we're going to be okay.
All right. So the purpose of this text, saying to bring all of this home, to get to the so what, to quote my dissertation advisor. The idea in writing this book is that Della Valle is going to use it as a tool to convert Aldin Alari, and his hope is that he's going to get Aulari to convert to Christianity, to give him this text, this original book of Job. And he's hoping that by sending him this text showing the superiority of European astronomy, that he's going to be able to kind of seal the deal on this on this conversion and get a hold of this book. I wish I had more time to kind of talk about what's going on in those pictures, but I don't. I think I'm going to go ahead and just wrap up where I am because of the time. But it's just some more images of this book. But yeah, it's an interesting case. Like, the reason that I originally, when I was talking with John, that I wanted to talk at least briefly about this book is you have this text on astronomy that is extremely influential. It was, in fact, the first book that introduced the Tychonic system of astronomy into the Arabic language, and it was widely cited within Arabic texts on astronomy. You have this book that was highly influential within the history of astronomy, but the purpose of its being written was actually espionage. It was an attempt to take Aulari, convert him to Christianity, and the purpose of this was to get a text that the astronomers that were Copernicans hoped they could use to get leverage over on the Catholic Church. And so you have this story of all of these pieces, all of these influential players who are astronomers, and their motivations are based in war. They're based in making deals and spying on other cultures. But at the end of the day, it ends up having a powerful effect on the history of astronomy as a whole, which is the kind of the point I guess I'll end on. I do want to say thank you to John Rummel, who, and just your Astronomical Society in general, for making the talk possible. Also, I want to thank Lawrence, who yesterday he helped me pre-troubleshoot Zoom. This is the second time I've ever used Zoom, so was a bit worried about that. I also do want to make a point of citing here Avner Ben-Zaken out of Harvard University. The title of his article is there. I'm not going to read it out, but the part of this story that deals with Pietro della Valle and Mario Schifano, he is really the architect who went through and did the work on that part of the story. The Borri bit is more my wheelhouse, and then of course the slideshow was made possible through Creative Commons, so thank you to them.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. Great presentation. Does anyone have any questions for him? Feel free to unmute and jump in. And I could probably just start off, listening to the overall talk. It just seems like, sometimes with maybe some of the people who are part of this effort to spread this tectonic astronomy, some of them probably may have looked at it as more of a political tool. This is a bit of leverage that we can use to maybe undermine public confidence in the Vatican, kind of in the same light where, some people might try to undermine an institution of authority. What do you have to say?
The Tychonic astronomy is interesting. Am I still yeah, I'm still sharing my screen. So one of the problems, really one of the reasons that TICO is important, if you look at these, let me zoom out and kind of run back real quick. If you look at each of these spheres, a major debate, and this is one of the things I'm deeply interested in historically. There was a lot of debate between 1550 and 1650 in that time frame about how the heavens were constructed. They knew the rough order of the planets, that much they had figured out, kind of. But the way that they understood them as existing was within these solid crystal spheres, which is fine until you get to the point to where astronomers have the tools, and in the case of Tycho Brahe and his observatory, it's advanced enough that he can work out the parallax to recognize that, hey, these comets are crossing the lines where these solid spheres are supposed to exist. So this immediately opens the question, how are there crystal spheres and comets crossing them? That doesn't work. So that's actually the reason that this fluid heaven is an issue for Borri. It's the reason he's teaching it. I didn't talk about it with Galileo, but my master's paper here at UW was on Galileo, and it was on Galileo's discussion of fluid heavens and his views on cosmology. So that's where a lot of that's coming from. I think you're right that even if you happen to be someone who was a Copernican, the Tychonic model was useful to you because it was a way of undermining support for the Ptolemaic system. And if you're a Copernican, your real competition for a lot of people, it's not going to be perceived as being Tycho, because Tycho is just this new thing. It's going to be Ptolemy, which is really the one that's it's the one that has a strong foothold in the universities, and it's also the one that really the church has kind of put a lot of their support behind. Now that's changing during this time period. The Jesuits, for example, ended up putting their support behind Tycho. The big advantage, which is the one that's being shown right now, and the big advantage of Tycho is that it allowed you to keep all of the observational advantages of the Copernican system while also keeping the Earth at the center of the universe and unmoving. So it was the Tychonic system. It's sometimes called the geo-heliocentric model. It was kind of the astronomical equivalent of having your cake and eating it too.
Yeah, and if memory serves me, they kind of some of the skeptics of the Tycho Brahe pointed out, well, if the Earth is moving, we should still be able to see, stellar parallax, and because they really couldn't observe it yet, then it was kind of a way to reason why that was the case, I suppose.
Right. That was exactly Tycho's argument. He basically said, I have the best observatory and tools that have ever been created, and if I can't see parallax, it's not there. He said his logical argument was the only way that we could be moving would be for the stars to be so unimaginably far away as to be beyond reason. that was a bad, that turned out to be a bad argument, but that was the argument he made.
At the time, a reasonable argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of astronomy. There's a really interesting story that one can tell that is nothing but the story of how the expansion of science in all kinds of ways has depended on the ability of humanity to expand its imagination, because it's not just distances. You see the same thing happening with time and with for example with evolution and with geological change, and things like that. The idea that the earth would have, for evolution to work, the earth would have to be so old it would be beyond anyone's ability to imagine. Well, it's kind of the same story, and there are historians who have told that story, but it is an interesting observation.
Does anybody else have a question? And James, just as a follow-up, because we know Galileo was a proponent of the fluid solar system. What about Copernicus?
Well, I would be hard pressed to say that Galileo was a proponent. Part of the problem is Galileo never says. We do know in the Assayer that he talks about what could be viewed as a kind of proto-atomism, maybe, but really he's talking about corpuscularity, something very similar to corpuscularianism. But one of what I did in my master's paper is I went through, and it all started when I was learning Italian, actually, because at the time I was having to study Galileo in English translation, namely using a lot of Stillman Drake. And if you read through that, Galileo is always talking about orbits. If you look at Galileo in the original Italian, he doesn't talk about orbits at all. And in fact, the idea of an orbit, the concept of an orbit, is a modern astronomical idea. And instead, he simply talks about planets moving. But the verb that he used was interesting. It was scorre. And we have a cognate in the English language to score something, to scratch it. And so one of the things I did is I said, okay, so when Galileo describes a planet moving, he says that it scores around the sun. So I went and I looked through his writing, and he only uses that verb to talk about two things. He uses it to talk about planets moving in space, and he uses it to talk about boats cutting through the water.
Oh.
So while Galileo doesn't ever explicitly come out and say that he believes that the heavens are fluid, I make an argument in my master's thesis that his verb choice is indicative of him thinking of it that way. He also often uses an allegory of the planets moving through the sky the way that birds move through the air or fishes move through the water. And then also there's a very interesting, there are two places he talks about it, but one of the things that Galileo talks about is why is it that the planets are moving in the first place? And he says that it's the motion of the sun spinning on itself and transmitting that motion to the planets that causes them to move. And it's very similar to the vortex theory that you later see in René Descartes in his astronomical system, or I should say cosmological system.
Very good, thank you. Yeah. Any more questions? And don't forget to unmute. Well, thank you so much, James. This has been a really great talk. And, one of the things I love about astronomy is, it's a field where, anybody who has a telescope can potentially contribute to the science. And I think that's also one of the great things about history too, that, topics like these might inspire us to kind of look for a niche of information that we're really interested in. And if nobody's published anything on it, have a crack at it. So it's really, really inspiring topic. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I'm
Thank you.
sorry I wasn't able to. I'm sorry the timing of the talk wasn't more under control. The last time I was giving lectures regularly was in 2016. So it's been nothing but conference papers since then, and I've kind of lost my timing.
Oh, it's very good, very good. Yeah, it's not the longest talk we've ever had, so don't worry about it. It was good material. Well, all right. So yeah, we hope to hear from you again and keep in touch. And on behalf of Madison Astronomical Society, thank you so much. And also on behalf of the board of directors, I'd like to thank everybody who logged in tonight and helped us do our annual meeting. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you all real soon.